Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Karine Wittmer. I am a Trade Commissioner Export Promotion at the Swiss Business Hub USA, and I am from Switzerland, Geneva. The Swiss Business Hub USA is the representation of the official international trade and investment promotion agency, Switzerland Global Enterprise. And in my role, I partner with C-level executives and entrepreneurs and provide market support and insights, partner search B2B and B2C marketing and sales strategies to Swiss companies venturing into the US market. So it is my pleasure to welcome you today to the Go Global Life Sciences series for an open discussion on how best to plan for expanding into the US market. I would like to take a moment to recognize and thank our partners, Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati, Niederherr Kraftfrei, Switzerland Global Enterprise, and the Consulate General of Switzerland, and of course the incredible teams who made that webinar possible. A quick note about our webinar today. So our discussion will last approximately 45 minutes and will be followed by a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A. You can submit your questions in the Ask a Question box, and we will try to answer to as many as possible. So let me start. Today I have the chance to welcome 4 speakers, bringing in an extensive amount of expertise in life sciences. So let me introduce you to Matthew Mayer. Matthew is Chief Client Corporate Development Advisor, and he leads the Life Sciences Business Advisory practice of Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati. Matthew has held diverse roles in private and public biopharma, medtech, and precision medicine companies, from startups to Fortune 50 in the US and in Europe. We have James Reed. James is a corporate and securities partner at Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati. James advises life sciences and technology companies on general corporate matters, M&A, initial public offerings, strategic partnerships, and private equity and debt financing. With us, Maximilian Bügler. Max is the Chief Technology Officer of Altoida AG. He focuses on the prediction of Alzheimer's and dementia disease by using machine learning procedures. In a nutshell, Altoida has developed an iOS and Android-based augmented reality technology, which tests the functional and cognitive aptitude of a patient. All data is automatically transmitted to the practitioner for diagnosis. And finally, on the venture side, we have Khalid Mentak. Kal is a Silicon Valley-based serial entrepreneur and institutional investors. He's a venture partner at Sulke Ventures AG and the co-founder of the Catalyst Technology Innovation Group, a medical project generator focused on selecting and financing companies addressing unmet clinical needs. So Switzerland ecosystem produces top-notch startups and companies in life sciences. And for these companies, going global is the next step in the plan towards expansion. So the US market, as we know, is a major player in the life sciences industry and a highly valuable market for Swiss companies. But voila, the US market is such a big, complex, and competitive market. So to open the discussion, I would like to invite Matthew and ask him what steps should a company take prior to entering the US market. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karine, and very excited to be part of the panel and grateful to participate today. We have a great group of panelists. So with that, for the folks in Switzerland, who are thinking about making a move into the U.S., as Karine said, and you all can appreciate this, it's a very complex market here, 335 million folks and a massive geographic scale with a confederate system not dissimilar to Switzerland, where you have your 26 cantons. We have, of course, 50 states. So, when I think about advising companies from a business perspective about coming into the U.S. from abroad, there are really 3 things that I look for and guide them to. First of all, really be clear on what your objectives are. Specifically, what are you looking to do? Are you a development stage company that wants to expand research partnerships and advance your pipeline by coming into the States? Are you looking for investment dollars, which is an often a common driver, and we'll speak about that today? Are you looking to commercialize your product? Are you at a point where you're going to launch it and you see the US market as obviously a natural opportunity to go into the largest economy in the world? Or are you looking to expand from a labor or human resources perspective? Or it could be a combination of these things. So I think you really want to be clear what do you want to achieve in the US market, and also be clear on timing. For some of you, you may be actively thinking about coming into the US now. For others, this may be something to think about in the future. And timing is critical. And I think those objectives will drive the right time to do it. And in my opinion, it's really never too early to start, because the planning process is critical and it can take time to do this successfully. The second thing that I'd really keep in mind here are understanding the differences. And I think a key part of what our panel wants to discuss today is highlighting some of these significant differences between the Swiss and the US markets. So that's obviously things like the regulatory environment. If you have a product that's going to undergo some sort of health approval, whether it's a device, a diagnostic, or a pharmaceutical, you want to really appreciate the nuances and the regulatory requirements that will vary inevitably from what you're used to in Switzerland. Second, of course, is the legal setup, the employment situation here, and recruiting, all very, very different. For example, in Europe and in Switzerland, when you have a CV, it's very common to have your date of birth on there as the candidate. In the United States, that would be absolutely prohibited and would create a lot of concern. So that's one example of something you have to really appreciate from a difference. Thirdly is reimbursement. If you have a product that's being reimbursed by a payer, the US system is incredibly complex, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. And then finally, and certainly not least in importance, are the cultural differences. In my career, I actually worked at Novartis in Basel for several years, and one of the things they did was do a cultural training course, and it was amazing, even for someone who's done a lot of European and international business, the subtleties with regard to cultural differences that are very important. So those are the things that you really have to appreciate, among others. And then lastly is getting connected with the right resources to help you be successful with your move into the US. So whether it's a law firm, a real estate broker, an HR representative, or a finance advisor, this is part of doing your homework and really helping you be successful so that you can enter most effectively. So let me leave it there. Those would be kind of my high level thoughts on that, Karine. And I know we're going to unpack a lot of that here in today's video.
Yeah, absolutely. And based on what you just said, I'm going to ask back to back. I'm going to start with Cal, because Cal has a broad experience by venturing and entering the US market with different companies, as well as Max with Altoida. So I'm going to start with Cal. Cal, with your experience and your background, what were the main challenges that you faced, and when you were guiding and driving a foreign company to the US market, what did you face?
Thank you, Karine. It's a pleasure to be here. Great panel. This is very timely. This pandemic has created a lot of issues for companies all over the world, and I'm glad to be here sharing my thoughts on the subject and on how to help companies really bridge the gap in terms of entering the U.S. market. Before I answer your question, Karine, I wanna echo a little bit what Matt just talked about, because it's very important for companies, based on my own experience in terms of having lived in Switzerland and worked with a lot of companies there, and being based in the U.S. It's really about planning. When you start thinking about coming to the U.S. as a life science company, planning is key, obviously, but the main questions that you should ask yourselves are, why do you want to come to the U.S.? And it's not a question of funding. It's not a question of addressing the biggest market. it's really whether it's right for you or not. If the U.S. market is a big percentage of your total addressable market, and to what extent also are you focused on capturing that market? That's the first question to answer. The second question is, do you really need boots on the ground to sell your product and service your customers? Very important. And once you address these questions, then you go to timing, and critical. When do you make the move? So you've decided that you have global ambitions, you want to address the U.S. market. When do you make that move? And that really depends on the kind of company you're building. And so if you're in life sciences, if you're developing an implantable device, which tends to be hardware heavy, you probably want to make the move as quickly as possible. In the digital world, and you can do things remotely now. And I hope we can help folks on their depending on their life cycle in terms of corporate life cycle, and also the particular situation. And the third question, which I think is also very critical, is the how. How do you? And planning, obviously, taking a few months to plan this is extremely important, but it starts with having the right professional advisors on your side. That includes legal counsel, tax advisors, human resources, regulatory consultants, and all of those things. And notice that I didn't really talk too much about the regulatory environment. It is very important. But in the investment world, that's in terms of quality, in terms of the move, is not a very difficult decision to make. We know they're pretty clear cut, and we can just assess. You look at the product and technology, you assess when that approval is going to happen. The intangibles in terms of the business environment is extremely important. So I before I address challenges, I want to make an echo some of what Matt has talked about, because a lot of companies don't really think about these things. They think that they go and start selling the product. So taking the time to immerse yourself in the U.S. market is extremely important. So in terms of challenges, and to address the question of challenges, and there are many challenges, and we might not get to all of them today, but hopefully we can give companies a template or a map, and really talk about the most important things to consider in terms of challenges. The first thing that stands out is it's a cultural thing, in fact, and I'm an inventor CEO of sorts, and I can relate to this. European companies in general tend to be product centric, not market centric, and in the U.S. that's critical, that the market angle is addressed very early on. Can you market the product? Do you have a market for it? Do you have a clear go-to-market strategy? And these things in a lot of European companies are important, but they tend to take a second seat, if you will, to how innovative the technology is, how great the product is. And I've seen incredibly successful U.S. companies that have average product, but absolutely flawless execution in terms of go-to-market strategy, deep knowledge of the healthcare system, and distribution channels and entry points and things like that are absolutely critical. And these are the companies that foreign companies are going to be competing against. So knowing that is extremely important. And the second challenge that I think is very important to consider is scaling. U.S.-based companies scale at a very, very fast pace. So competitively, you want to be able to address that very early on. How are you going to scale in the U.S.? it's a completely different story than scaling in Switzerland or France or another country. And I've seen a lot of companies have fail and have problems because they couldn't really address the scaling pace that because it's a big market, it's a market that moves fast, that has nuances that are extremely important in terms of scaling. And the other thing in terms of challenges also is to really make sure that that you don't just dip your toe, as we say in the U.S. market. You really immerse yourself in it. And I think that's the only way to learn and really get a sense of how your product fits in the market. And really not the other way around. It's really looking at even at a level of the operating room, how would your product fit within the operating room dynamics? I mean, things that are very specific to the U.S. market and healthcare market as well. And I'll stop at that, and I think we'll unpack a lot of these things as we move forward.
No, I love what you're saying, because in fact, it just brings me to Max, because you said something very important. The US market moves fast. You need to address the market, and you need to immerse yourself and the product within the market. And you mentioned digital health, and our world is going and moving fast into that direction. So that question is for Max. And why did Altoida choose to enter the US market, and what opportunities does the US market offer for companies such as Altoida in the digital health sector?
So, first of all, thanks for having me in this panel. It's a great event. And thanks, Cal, for bringing up the product-centric versus market-centric aspect of things, because it's a very important one. And I've seen lots of companies which were very product-centric, but nobody cares about how good your product is if they don't have a way to use it, or they don't see the place where it fits. So in our endeavor, it was an important lesson to learn. We have to focus more on what people can do with it, what the use is, and where it fits into the market, rather than that it's a great product. It's useful if it's a great product, but it's also important that it has its place in the market. And to answer your question, Karine, is the US offers a much bigger market than the EU for us in digital health, because on the one hand, the EU is more divided than the US. In the US, you have one great market, and the EU you have different countries. You have, on the clearance side, you have the CE mark, which kind of unites the countries. But as soon as it gets to reimbursement, you have not only each country separate, but you also have, in some countries like Germany, you have nearly 100 health insurances, and you basically need a contract with each of them to get reimbursement in Germany. And in the US, it's more worth the effort to go through these procedures, because the market is just much bigger in that sense. And another important aspect is that the attitude in Europe towards healthcare costs is different than the US. In Europe, healthcare more or less is considered something that should be free from a patient point of view. And in the US, it's something really expensive. So from that perspective, the US offers a much more attractive market, because it values the healthcare products more. And for us as a company, we had, it was planned for a longer time. And the first thing we did was to get FDA approval, so that we have a safe base to start operating with our product in the US. I think that's something that is an important first step.
Yeah, it's a very important step, and we're going to talk a little bit down the road about regulatory and FDA. But Still-based, when I look at preparing, implementing the company in the United States, we hear from our startups sometimes that it's easy to land on the East Coast instead of the West Coast, right? And access to workforce might be a question, skills, time zone, access to capital, or finding the right partners. And I would like to ask Matthew and Max, both of you, what would you recommend for a company when they approach the US market? How do they need to think about that, setting up the company, the location, finding the right location? And Altoida, you decided to set up in Houston, Texas. What challenges did you encounter, if any? So I'll start with Matthew first, and Max, you can jump on it after that.
Sure. So, of course, there are many, many factors here we need to keep in mind if you're coming into the States. Let's say you've decided, okay, you want to have an office. What's the right decision? So clearly, proximity to Switzerland is a factor, in particular with regard to time zones, right? I'm based in San Francisco, for example, and we're always playing catch up, even with our colleagues on the East Coast, given the 3-hour difference. So when you're dealing with Switzerland, of course, that would be a 9-hour time difference versus 6 if you're on the East Coast. So I don't want to trivialize the importance of that, because at the end of the day, you're going to be doing so much, whether it's Zoom calls or telephone conferences, and having more overlap with your home market and headquarters is a factor. So clearly, I think East Coast, therefore, is an advantage. But I don't really think that, in my opinion, is the main factor. The main factor, again, gets back to what are your objectives, right? Why are you in the US? Are you here because you primarily want to access capital, or are you here because you want to have a commercial footprint for your product? So, and of course, there'll be many reasons why you're here. But that gets me to access to labor, as Karine mentioned. That's probably the most critical factor, in my opinion, here. If you're coming into the US, whether you're doing research and development or you're commercializing your product, you want to be thoughtful about being able to hire the right talent. So as most of you know, historically in life sciences, the Boston area on the East Coast and the Bay Area on the West Coast of the States have been the dominant players with regard to life science startups. That's historically where the greatest access to capital has been with regard to the VC community. In my opinion, over the past 10 years, there's been a significant shift away from those areas. And while they remain the dominant geographies with regard to labor pool and capital, there's been a big shift into other regions. And in particular, in the East Coast, areas like the Philadelphia area and the Mid-Atlantic and Research Triangle Park in North Carolina have been emerging as having stronger ecosystems, both with regard to venture funding as well as access to capital, or rather access to labor. So the advantage of those regions is multifold. Number one, the cost of having to set up an office and the cost of hiring labor is significantly lower in those areas. As you probably know, Boston and San Francisco typically command the highest compensation rates, and their office space costs are also the highest. So I think for a company, especially one that's looking carefully at their budget, considering those alternatives on the East Coast could make a lot of sense. And then also, and this is a great segue to hear from Max about his experience in Texas, but Texas has emerged as a huge area for life sciences, whether it's Austin, Houston, or Dallas. It's a big market, access to great institutions, world-class universities, and more venture funds are setting up there. So I think if you're thinking beyond the East Coast, an area like Texas could be very attractive. And lastly, I want to kind of mention that a lot of states outside of the Boston, Massachusetts, and California region are getting smart with regard to providing incentives for startups and emerging growth companies to relocate or locate their U.S. offices in their areas. So I think it's important, again, whether it's working with the Swiss Trade Commission or other advisors to really thoughtfully think about what you might be able to take advantage of with regard to favorable tax and other economic incentives that would make a move to that region even more attractive. So I think I'll leave it there and see if we can hear from Max in terms of his real world experience, having done this from Switzerland into Texas. Max?
Exactly, in Houston.
So for us, it was, and I think it generally is a rather individual question. So it's a decision every company has to make on based on their specific requirements. And the Houston, Texas was for us, the decision for Houston, Texas for us was based on multiple aspects. On the one hand, we had the Texas Medical Center, which built an incentive for us, which is a innovation hub in that area right now for digital health. And we had an investor that wanted us to move there in addition, which is a very individual incentive. And generally, the area had put the bar high to become the leading brain health innovator. And so those things drove us there. And we don't regret that choice. It was a good place to be. But on the personal side, I can echo Matthew a bit because we noticed that asking people to move to Houston, Texas isn't a good idea for everyone. I mean, there were some potential hires who saw that as a strong negative point because, and I think that's also something to take into consideration. That Houston, Texas it's very hot, it's very humid, and it's not the most favorite place in the US for many people. Yeah.
So that's the human component, right? That you have to take into consideration as well. So once you've done all that, review about why, how, when, and the timing, there's two parts that are very important, and they've been mentioned. It's navigating the legal environment and accessing fundings, right, for any type of companies. And here we're going to talk a little more into details about what important legal aspects prior to entering the US market should a startup consider. And we're going to highlight a little bit about the regulatory and the compliance environment in the life sciences sector, and if it is important to be incorporated or doing business prior raising funds before jumping into the real core discussion about fundings. So I would like to invite James to answer that question and maybe tell us what legal steps should a startup take before entering the US market.
So, hi, I'm James Huey. I'm a corporate partner at Wilson Sonsini. Even before considering entering into the US market, and the other speakers have touched on it, but it's really important to do your homework on the patent side and the regulatory side. I won't dive into those too deeply, but just from a high level, patents and patent strategy is very different in Switzerland and the EU compared to the US. I'd say in Switzerland, it's much more of like a requirement that is checked off the box, and the patent teams are very amenable. But in the US, the patent strategy is much more aggressive, because the thought is if we're going to look at a market based approach, that aggressive patent strategy will give the company an edge to knock out and prevent competitors from competing with the product. So I think even before thinking about entering into the US market, you really need to hire a US style patent law firm, because that's going to be the driver when you go to approach the various US investors. Okay, but now then the question is corporate structure. This is really going to be a push and pull between different stakeholders. There's generally three different options. One option is just to stay as a Swiss company, and maybe some investors, especially the larger US investors, can invest directly into the Swiss entity. A second, which is more common, and for a lot of US investors, they might require the company to flip into a Delaware C Corp. That's the standard C Corp, the standard structure, and that's driven by a number of factors, but one main factor is some of the smaller funds just don't have the sophistication or resources to spend to have a complex international tax structure. So they might say, well, let's have a normal looking Delaware C Corp that they're used to investing, and then they can apply their resources to a structure that's familiar with them. And then a third structure might be a parent company on top. So, and in a jurisdiction like the UK, Luxembourg, Ireland, Dutch, or Swiss, and then having an operating company in the US and an operating company in Switzerland. And so those are the three main structures. But then when I mention, what are some of the competing thoughts? On one hand, you have the investor that's going to say, I'm only going to invest my money if we go with the structure that works for that particular investor. And so that's going to drive a lot of the discussions on one side. But on the other side, we have to take a look at the Swiss investors, or the existing Swiss stockholders. So depending on the structure that the investor proposes, that the Swiss stockholders have to examine with the international and a Swiss tax advisor to make sure that the proposed structure doesn't create a taxable event for the Swiss stockholders, especially at the mid to late stages where you don't want to go forward with the financing and then find out the existing Swiss stockholders are subject to large amounts of tax.
So it's very a fine line between finding the right structure and balancing with the investment or the investors willing to jump into the journey, right? With a foreign company.
That's correct. So it's very driven by tax. That's one of the main drivers. And then the other driver is also to say, well, what is the future plan? So don't companies need to look at, and when talking with their advisors and that both legal and tax, say, okay, our plans initially is to do this financing, but what does the future look like? Do we do a US IPO, or do we do an IPO from Switzerland, like Logitech or other as a foreign company? And I would say doing an IPO from the US on the US, one of the US stock exchanges, the governance is going to be easier coming from Delaware in terms of governance and tax and whatnot. So that's a long-term consideration.
But based on what you just said, there's one other aspect that I would like to highlight. What about merger and acquisition? Because M&A, we know what's happening right now with the current COVID situation might be slowing down, but it's something that might be rebounds. It's quite an option for medtech companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the medtech market, what we're seeing is a slowdown because of COVID-19 in certain industries. So for a digital health company that is offsite, it's not such as important to have as many in-person meetings to examine the company and the platform and the software. However, for a medtech or a biotech company, those particular deals have slowed down because the international travel has been hampered due to COVID-19. And so some of these are getting longer and drawn out. But once we're in a post-COVID world, it'll be interesting to see how quickly they jump back in and international travel returns.
So we have to the companies that have to think about the way to incorporate or to prepare the entry to the market legally. But there's also the regulatory and the compliance environment in the life sciences sector that a startup should be aware of. So do you believe, and that's for Matthew or James, that does it have to be CE labeled prior to applying to FDA? Does it facilitate or fast track the process? And is it as well an aspect that can be relevant for investors?
Yeah, I can take that first. So I think, first when we think about the regulatory differences between the United States and Europe and Switzerland, we have to remind ourselves that obviously there's so many different types of products coming to market, right? So if you're talking about a pharmaceutical, therapeutic versus a diagnostic or a medical device, the regulatory situation, of course, is different. So in the context of your question, Karine, with regard to a CE mark, I think clearly, coming into the U.S. regulatory system with an existing approval is a good thing. And ultimately, the regulators in the U.S. are going to look carefully at the data, the publications, and the clinical studies that you have conducted. So, for example, if you're talking about a diagnostic product, typically the bar to getting a CE mark, and I'm generalizing here, it isn't that high. Whereas in the U.S., to get approval of a diagnostic, if it's a lab-based test, you need to have a lab set up and certified in the U.S. that's running the test. So I think it's hard to be able to generalize that having a CE mark is going to allow you to get equivalent approval in the U.S. But again, it's really a fact-specific analysis, and you have to be thoughtful about the data, as I said. And if it's a lab test, setting up a lab here is critical. If it's a pharmaceutical or a device, then the regulators, the FDA, which controls these approvals, as you know, in the US, are going to look at the data, they're going to look at the publications, and they're also going to look at the patient population, and they're going to see if there are any differences in the two target populations. Typically, that's not an issue in my experience between the US and Europe. But those are really the factors that you have to think about. So I would just, to summarize it, I would say, again, you need to work with an experienced regulatory attorney or advisor who understands the system here, and ideally who has taken products from Switzerland and has gotten them approved here. And I think this is a key part of your strategy to come to the U.S. is to really understand what the requirements would be and how much additional work would there be. And then lastly, given sort of the unprecedented nature of the COVID pandemic, the FDA has become much more agile in terms of quickly reviewing certain therapies or diagnostics that are instrumental in the treatment of COVID and related diseases, something called the Emergency Use Authorization Scheme, or EUA. So to the extent there are companies in Switzerland that have products that might fall within COVID-related applications, it could be a very good time for you to think about that, because it actually could fast-track the process significantly.
True. Based on that, there's as well something I wanted to highlight. It's this year in September, the FDA launched its Digital Health Center of Excellence to ensure that the most innovative digital health technologies are rapidly developed and reviewed as well in the US. So I was wondering, how is the US market taking data protection into consideration when you're dealing with digital data-driven companies in the life sector, right? We have more and more digital health solution and diagnosis companies developed in Switzerland or in Europe, and and they have the GDPR compliance versus any type of compliance here in the United States. And Max can talk about Altoida, which is a good example about how they had to consider the terms of privacy rules when entering the U.S. market.
Yeah.
Sorry,
so
that's
unfortunately, in the U.S., there's not a universal set of privacy regulations. Instead, it's a number of patchwork that a digital health company would have to comply with. So, in one side, we have the federal level, and on the federal level, we have the FTC, or the Federal Trade Commission, and they bring enforcements against deceptive or unfair privacy and data security practices. And that's very broad, not just unique to healthcare, but it does apply to healthcare, life science, and medical device companies. A second part of the federal patchwork is HIPAA, or the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And this applies to healthcare privacy laws on a federal level. And then there's other ones on the federal level that's similar to GDPR that apply to B2B marketing activities and whatnot. So that's all on the federal level. Then on the state level, what we're seeing is states starting to address privacy considerations on a state-by-state level. So most notably, California has passed the most comprehensive and stringent U.S. Privacy laws, and it's called the CCPA, which went into effect this year. But earlier this month, we just had our elections, and an even more rigorous law got passed called the CPRA. And these regulations are going to look much more like the GDPR style consumer privacy rights, and those will update in 2023. So one thing to note, though, you might say, well, okay, if a company is not based in California, does this CCPA or CRPA or CPRA apply? Well, the thing is that these California regulations don't only apply to California companies. Instead, they actually apply equally to non-US companies that do business in California and collect personal information from Californians. So in some sense, entering into the US market, well, whether you're based in Houston or on the East Coast, digital health companies need to be aware of the CCPA. So, in general, it does help that a company is familiar and is in line with GDPR. But when they come to the US, they're going to have to address this patchwork of privacy considerations on the federal and state levels.
Max, what did you experience on your site with Altoida in terms of privacy with the diagnosis platform?
So before moving to the US, we worked on being GDPR compliant, of course, because we were doing business in the EU. And from our experience, the extra requirements compared to GDPR to becoming HIPAA compliant in the US weren't that big of a deal. So it shouldn't be a problem with a decent legal team to overcome any extra obstacles that would be faced in the US. This patchwork that James mentioned with California data protection laws and so on is something to address. But if you can follow a rather pessimistic approach on your data management, I think there is a fairly intuitive, safe way to handle it. What is another issue that we faced, a more non-legal but practical issue, is that Americans generally are more protective of their personal data than Europeans are, from our experience at least, because in the US, they are afraid that the insurance or the employer could get hold of that data and the insurance fees might go up or they may lose their job and things like that. That were issues that were raised when working in the US that we didn't encounter in the EU at all. So that is something that that came from our experience.
That's very interesting. Based on all what we said, there's one last topic that I would like to address before we're going to jump into the questions. It's about fundings. A lot of companies from Switzerland or Europe, of course, are coming to the United States to raise funds. And it's very competitive and challenging. And I have some questions typically like, what do venture capitalists or investors look for in a foreign startups? You know, what are the key requirements a startup has to fulfill in order to be considered for investment? And those type of questions I would like to ask James and Cal to elaborate a little bit more. Typically, James, is it essential for a foreign company to be incorporated in the US or to already do business in the US to be able to raise capital? And Cal, based on your broad experience as well and being an investor, what are the key ingredients to be successful in raising capital here in the US?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I want to talk about the investment environment in the US. And we can't talk about it without talking about the pandemic. So before the pandemic, the investment environment was thriving, valuations were up, we were deploying capital at a record pace, and things were going extremely well. Then the pandemic hit. And, after the shock, I think what we're discovering is that the investment world and the investment, the VC community and the VC investments going into life sciences is very resilient. And we're seeing capital going back to work now, not only for COVID, for companies that are developing products for COVID, but for healthcare investments in general. And we've seen some tactical things like a lot of VCs slowed down their new financing, but started to double down on their own portfolio companies. But what this is telling us is that based on what we've seen with the pandemic and based on how resilient the industry is, I think the VC community feels that this is a good time to start a life science company. I think that the capital will flow again after the pandemic, and after life normalizes, it will flow at even a higher rate, in my opinion. Now, coming back to the question of what do we look for in a life science company, there are the things that you hear about all the time, that are universal to VC investments, like the size of the market, the quality of the management team, the founding team, the track record of the management team, the go-to-market strategy and things like that. But there are certain things that are very specific to life science companies, investing in life science companies. And one of them is clearly articulating what the clinical need is. And also, especially for the US market, and this is very important for foreign companies to know, having a really sophisticated go-to-market strategy addressing the healthcare system, because I'm repeating what we've said all along in this event, is that the healthcare system is not only complex, but it's very dynamic. It changes a lot. And we've seen with the pandemic, for instance, that the changing. Hospitals are changing the way they purchase not only equipment, but how to deploy that equipment as well, and products and implantable devices and things like that. So especially for a foreign company to seek U.S. investments, they need to really understand that, yeah, the product is good, innovation is good, having a great product is almost like the price of admission. But demonstrating that you're addressing a clinical need, having a crisp go-to-market strategy with all of the supporting facts is extremely important. And obviously the quality of the management team. And that relates to whether, a question that I get a lot, whether the founder and CEO of the company should move to the US or not. And the consensus has been that, well, yeah, the CEO and the founder should be here for an investment to flow into the company. But I think the answer is a little bit more nuanced. It really depends on the size of the VC also. If it's a large VC that's got the sophistication to allow that founder and CEO to work from a European location, that's fine. But in general, a founding team that has a track record that demonstrates or demonstrating that they can execute, and most importantly, and lastly, a founding team that listens. Because in the US, I think one of the most important things that the investors bring to the table is operating experience. We all do that. We help these companies or these founders build companies around the product. So there's a lot of operating input from the VC operator that is working with the founder. That's different from VCs in Europe. A little different is that we really get our hand. We really help the founder make decisions, and having a founding team that listens to the advice is extremely important. So those are some of the things that I think are very important in considering approaching U.S. VCs for investment in life science companies.
Thank you, Cal. James, do you believe that it's going to be my last questions, because we have 5 to 10 minutes left to answer the questions. Do you believe that it is essential for a foreign company to be incorporated in the US or already do business in the US to be able to raise capital?
I would say from the Series A and B stages, many of those investors really do prefer to invest in the Delaware C Corp, partly because of the resources that they have. It makes it easier for them to make the investment in a familiar structure that is not too expensive. However, with VCs that are making larger capital investments, whether it's in maybe a therapeutic or Series C and later, then the requirement for Delaware C Corp may not be as important, because they can navigate through a more complex international tax structure. So it really depends on the particular investor and stage. So when a company does go out and tries to approach the different levels of investors with the various investment sizes, I think they have to just understand, and they'll find out through discussions and also consulting their network and their advisors to say, well, what are the requirements to approach this large fund? What are the requirements for this medium-sized fund? What is the requirements for this angel fund? So that's a work in progress, and it's something to consult with advisors on.
So I would say that it really takes a village, dedication, time, and commitment to go global and to enter the market. I would like just to pick 2 or 3 questions that we have in the audience that maybe James or Matthew can answer. What about having an own subsidiary in the US to start? And that could be as well seen under the angle about raising funds down the road, about doing business. So what would be your advice on that question?
From a business side, I would say it really depends on kind of where you are in your stage of development as a company. If you have, for example, a product that you're marketing, then I think having a US sub makes good sense because you want to be able to contract and do business directly with a US entity. However, if you're still a development stage company, then I don't think it's an essential requirement. As James was saying, I think it sort of depends on what your strategy is. If you're looking to attract investment from US VCs, then you have to think about either having a US subsidiary or, as James indicated, potentially flipping where you actually have the US as the parent company, because US investors typically prefer to invest onshore, although not always. So that would be my thoughts on the business side. I don't know, James, if you would add anything.
I agree with those thoughts. It just really depends on the stage of the company. So a later stage company that's not looking for fundraising, creating a subsidiary just to do operations, sales, and in the US makes sense. But if the goal is to raise money from a development stage company and the goal is to raise from US VCs, then that subsidiary structure may not be appropriate. So it just depends on the stage of the company and what the company is trying to achieve.
Okay. I have another long question from Simon. Being an equipment manufacturer for life science, producing in Switzerland and currently selling through a distributor, we would be interested in your thoughts about the pros and the cons of setting up an own office. Question 1, selling customer services to US-based life science customers. What are cost-effective options for an SME to set up and run a US customer service organization? And question 2, what considerations do you see whether to sell equipment directly from the Swiss company to the end customer versus selling through a local distributor?
Yeah, I can expand. I can try to answer the question.
Thank you, Cal.
It goes back to being market centric versus product centric. If you're going to sell a product in the U.S., even through a distributor, you're going to have a really, especially if you have DME or a durable medical goods, a piece of equipment, you're going to have to set up a customer service that responds in real time to the problems, and this is maybe a cultural difference too. I think customers in the U.S., especially in the medical field, they expect flawless service, and so I've seen a lot of, especially in the equipment business, really not give a lot of importance to customer service, to service in the equipment and things like that. And again, this is very specific to the US market. So regardless of whether you're going to sell through a distributor or you're going to sell directly from Switzerland, having a US-based customer service and also servicing infrastructure is extremely important. In terms of cost effectiveness, how do you decide that? It really depends on the company. It depends on what cycle you're in terms of your corporate cycle. And it's very difficult to whether you want to invest large capital in the U.S. to do these operations or do it directly from Switzerland. It really depends on where you are with your company. But again, I think within the framework of what we're talking about here, having a good understanding not only of the market but the product journey as it relates to the patient journey as well, and to the hospital if you're selling to a hospital or any healthcare facility. And these things are very difficult to nail down from a distance, so to speak. You really have to talk to people who've been doing it for a long time as advisors, or you come and immerse yourself to understand the nuances of distributing a product, especially if it's a piece of equipment, which tends to be a little bit more complex than just selling an implantable device or a disposable device, because you're building a relationship with whoever you're selling that piece of equipment to.
Based on what you're saying and based on the previous question about having a subsidiary or incorporating, there's another question, and I think that's for Matthew or James. What about manufacturer's liability? If you have one sentence, one thing that you can highlight and provide, because we haven't covered the liability, which is something very important here in the United States.
So I can start, James, and jump in. I think it's a reminder for folks in Switzerland that the U.S. is a much more litigious country than almost any other country in the world, meaning people sue for anything, and the ability to recover damages is typically much greater, and the awards given to plaintiffs for injuries tend to be higher. So I think you need to be very careful about protecting your company from against liability, and you need to be thoughtful in terms of how you contract to protect against liability through contractual relationships, and also ensuring that you have adequate liability insurance for the U.S. entity to ensure that if there is litigation, you have coverage in the event you have to pay damages. James, would you want to add anything?
No, just aside that it's usually through an insurance broker to get the proper insurance, but it's important to sit down with that broker and really explain to them the business and the potential liabilities, because what a company wants to avoid is to if I think there's a saying, if the crap hits the fan, then there's adequate coverage to protect the company, so that then, as opposed to the company needing to shut down because it can't afford the liability that it walked into. So really important to sit down with that insurance broker and help them understand the business and all the potential liabilities.
And as time flies by so fast, I'm going to end with the last question, and I think it's for you all. From examples of failure of international companies trying to come into the US market that you know of, can you name the mistakes, reasons for failure that you've seen most often? It's a hard one.
I would say, this is Cal. I would say that the one thing that stands out most of the time, for me personally, based on my experience, is underestimating the complexity of the healthcare of the U.S. healthcare market. It's even for us, and along with my colleagues, have operated medical device companies. To this date, we're still confused by some aspects of that healthcare system in terms of how the goods are delivered to the end users, and the reimbursement environment, and the logistics of it all. So, if there's one advice that I repeat and keep repeating to most companies, is never to underestimate that market. Not only not underestimate it, but to keep in touch with it and immerse yourself in it, whether directly or through good professional advisors.
So one last word of wisdom from each of you, Matthew, James, Maximilian, for our audience.
Yeah, I would just say from my side, do your homework on coming to the U.S. and don't underestimate the complexity, and make sure you have sufficient resources to be able to address the various challenges and questions that hopefully we've been able to address on this conversation today with you.
My thought is, in the U.S., people are very collaborative, especially in the life science industry. So advisors, service providers, investors, and other CEOs they like to meet, they like to brainstorm, and they like to help each other out. So don't be afraid to reach out.
Max, a last word of wisdom for our audience based on your experience.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, you shouldn't be afraid to make the step, but you should educate yourself properly before you make it.
That's good. Well, thank you very much all for your time. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Maximilian, Cal, Matthew, and James. Thank you to our partners for such a great discussion. I wish we could keep on going and going. There's so many topics we haven't had the time to address. Please feel free to reach out. We are here to support any companies, Swiss companies, interested by entering the US market, its complexity. And I wish you a nice evening in Switzerland and a good day here in the Bay Area or in Houston.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.